Hope Cook here with Dermcast.live. Today I have Jason Roddick. Jason has his MBA. He also has a doctorate of medical science in addition to his master's of medical science. And he's a coding guru. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, how you doing?
Great. So I would love to talk to you today about coding and why it is so important in dermatology.
Well, it's kind of misunderstood, and it's the dirty secret underlying the business of being in medicine in general. And it's the dirty secret because it's never the primary goal to make money. You can't have the notion of it's all about money, because it's not. It's not even remotely about money, but there is a marriage of what services we're providing for the patient and a business that we run that can facilitate those services. If you're highly unsuccessful of making any revenue, you won't be able to provide those services for patients for long. So you have to see them as a marriage. One is of opportunity and one is of this ability to provide the service to the patient.
And you also gave a number that described how much we undercharge. Can you talk about that?
Well, in 2018, and I'm sure there's other data points out there, but in 2018, anywhere from $357 million in underbilled, under-collected type charges were produced. And in one particular code alone, about 17 to 18% were below or considered undercoded. So just shy of 1 in 5 charts were undercoded. And there's a lot of reasons that were stated in research as to why. A lot of it was fear. Everybody fears an audit. No one wanted to be doing it wrong. And if you were going to do it wrong, you didn't want to be wrong on the high end, where an audit would cost you fines and things like that from Medicare services. If you're going to be anywhere, if you're going to make a mistake, it felt safer to make the mistake on the bottom end. The problem is that we probably shouldn't be making a mistake 1 out of 5. It's understandable and appreciable to make mistakes or to try to be conservative, but I think any business would not want to make a mistake 1 out of 5 times.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to undercharge if you were a retailer selling clothes, 1 out of 5 garments you were selling, or a coffee shop that was forgetting to charge 1 out of 5 cups of coffee. So if you look at it from that perspective, you really just say, yeah, some error in the till is going to happen, but we don't want to make that error to that extent.
That makes sense, because you're leaving money on the table and it's not good for your employer.
No, and ultimately, as if you hear the struggles, we simultaneously have this one struggle. So we're leaving a bunch of money on the table, we're underserving the employer, and we're simultaneously, I'm answering a ton of emails about, we'll call it getting paid what we're worth. And so we're simultaneously saying maybe, just maybe, there's a reason to suspect that physician assistants out there are not being valued in a contract the way they are supposed to, and simultaneously leaving 20% of the revenue on the doorstep never to be collected. They're conflicting messages. So it is our job to provide the best service possible to the patient, the most accurate and the least liable. So we want to provide good, solid medicine. And then when that happens, our job is to keep our practice in business. And they're not mutually exclusive. They're actually mutually inclusive. They should be considered one and the same. You'll do the job first, and then you'll get paid what you're worth second, and they don't happen independently of each other.
Right.
And I think we just see money as greed in society. And to be honest with you, we've seen plenty of examples where money is greed in our society. So that makes it very difficult to just have a good academic conversation about the correct way of doing things. And because all of a sudden, anytime someone evaluates you and says, I think you're trying to be greedy, and that's a very arbitrary feeling, like all of a sudden you're at that quandary, you're at that dilemma where I'm not trying to be greedy, I just want to get paid what I'm worth.
Yeah. And you gave a very specific example earlier when you talked about 99213s versus 99214, and how before the coding changed, very few of us were charging 99214s on a regular basis. And now, I'll let you explain.
Well, when the E&M codes got changed, they stayed away from the quantity. It was about quantity, if you could just surmise it before. So prior to these changes, it was about how many review systems you did. And you're not allowed to just run all 15 of them. So you can't, they had to be poignant or on point to the actual purpose of the chief complaint. So how many review systems did you do? And then how many areas were examined? In the case of, or systems examined, but in the case of skin, that became a little bit more convoluted because we might not necessarily have a medical need to do a cardiac exam, a pulmonary exam, and those things. So it literally became a method of counting areas. And so when you had acne, let's say, you might get chest, shoulders, you know, this upper trunk area in the face. And that may or may not have qualified you, despite spending minutes with this person, having maybe a decent amount of complexity, let's say with even Accutane therapy or you were still limited to a lesser charge purely because you didn't get enough examined. So I guess you could start trying to justify examining their toe for acne to just put another check mark, but we know that that's greedy.
Yeah.
What Medicare did when they created the new system was said, we're going to forgo areas entirely. We are only going to base it on the medical decision making. So they're going to base it on the nature of the problem, the chronicity of the problem, and the side effects potentially to the problem, so the comorbidity. And that meant that acne gets to be treated like COPD, like diabetes, like anything, providing it warrants it. And it did not matter now if it was 5 systems, 10 systems, 16 systems. There's not really 16. But it all came down to literally, can I justify the decision? And that's how much you're going to get paid. So to answer the question more directly, the paradigm shift switched to where it's far easier, not that was its purpose, but in dermatology specifically, it is far easier to justify and to get a 214 visit than it ever has been before. And mathematically, it was around 20% national average, give or take, were a 214 in the past, and I think when we start really seeing numbers, you're going to see that climb as people become more and more familiar. I have not seen data to suggest that it's significantly higher, but I know it is easier to get a 214 visit than it was in the past.
Yeah, I feel like we're definitely seeing a lot more 99214s.
Yeah.
And will you explain a little bit how you can have a chronic medical condition and how that can give you a 99214 with certain criteria?
Well, chronic conditions, which have not been defined by time, but they're defined by the nature of the complaint, when they're subject to some form of progression, some exacerbation, some worsening, or a side effect of a medicine or implementation of therapy that you had, that alone will qualify on one of the 3 categories as a 214 or 204 visit. So, and that, in dermatology, like a lot of other medicine, we deal with a lot of chronic conditions. They may not be lifelong, but if you just start running down the list of some of the most common diagnoses that you can come up with, rosacea, psoriasis, atopic derm, or any of the eczemaceous conditions, you start naming them off. Even acne, you know, acne is a 6 to 8 year process, give or take, and for some women and some men, but especially some women into their 20s, 30s, 40s, you can almost say lifelong. So we're already dealing with chronic conditions. The question is whether or not we are treating these people as they come in and out for any kind of progression of their disease state, whether or not they are have an exacerbation. Like a lot of the eczematous conditions will flare seasonally. And when you see those, that qualifies as a 214 visit if the second category, which is the medical decision, your intervention as a medical provider, also qualifies. And they typically do. It typically takes some prescription management, some change in prescription management, some consideration of comorbid factors. And it's even loosely defined, but even the way it's defined is just comically easy to get to a 214 or 204 visit, just based on a single chronic condition that has an exacerbation or progression.
I agree. And if you have 2 or more chronic conditions,
you're instantly there.
Even if there's no exacerbation.
Even if they're stable.
Yeah.
So they come in, they've been happy with you, they're a long-term patient. Fred, the guy that's been seeing you for his rosacea and his dry skin eczema, he's super happy, just comes in his yearly visit, just wants his refills and everything else. But the fact that you addressed them, you made sure your history is going to define the fact that they've been stable, that he's happy, that he has no side effects of the medicine. Just the fact that you're addressing both these conditions will qualify you.
Yeah.
So it gets quite easy. And it's not meant to make it easy. It's not, I can't imagine that the people that came up with this condition, this coding structure, thought dermatology and said, we got to make it easier for those guys. That's not what happened at all. It's just that they created a definition. And the one thing that's important to understand is that when they were doing it across the board, you can only imagine they were having conversations about all sorts of chronic diseases. If you go from everything from high blood pressure to hypercholesteremia, and if you think about internal medicine and general practitioners, the myriad of conditions they're dealing with and the complexity is all there. And the one thing that's the Medicare services did when they defined this, and this is made in part with AMA, is they did not prioritize disease states, because that you can only imagine the ostracization of people if that occurred. So if they labeled disease states by severity, period, based on the name, then they would say acne is not worth anything, but high blood pressure is.
Yeah.
And so now the person that is suffering from acne feels less valued. Their medical problem isn't as severe as high blood pressure. It may not be for their life as far as their heart health is concerned, or maybe a stroke or cardiac severity is concerned, but it's still important to them. And there's no separation of those, and that's nice, because that would also, can you imagine what that would do to the profession of the number of dermatology offices that wouldn't see acne? Wouldn't see, let's say we labeled all eczematous conditions as extremely benign. They don't justify anything above a 202. It wouldn't be long until the very business of dermatology made it impossible for you to see some of these chronic conditions because they didn't pay. The nice thing is there's no bias. It doesn't matter what your condition is. If it's chronic, it's chronic. And if it's a medical ICD-10 diagnosis, then it qualifies.
What other problems do you see us doing as dermatology PAs? Are there any pet peeves that you have when you audit somebody's billing?
In the billing department, I think that there's I think there's a devaluation of surgeries. Surgeries for us can sometimes be quite simple and quick. And when you think surgery, even a patient thinks surgery, like you're going to need a surgery for this. The average patient will assume intubation on a OR table. They almost think the worst if they've never had a little small skin surgery. And the problem is we have a tendency to devalue closures. So there's very few procedures, surgical procedures in dermatology that doesn't necessitate, and this is obviously up for debate, but often never necessitates at least a subcutaneous suture to maintain wound tension and facilitate good healing. That automatically qualifies for an intermediate closure. There are so few instances where a simple closure is ever conducted. So you'll see people often deferring to simpler closures. Undermining one of the most important things you could do to a closure of many surgeries, especially where you void an area of skin. So if you actually remove skin, you obviously are going to take side A, side B, put them together. You're going to have inherently more tension than you ever started with. And the area will be very specific to that tension. Extensive undermining, which is clearly defined now by these codes as any distance that is equal to or greater, or actually greater than the width of the surgical excision. The minute you get to that, and you start putting subcutaneous sutures, you're a complex closure. There's medical necessity for complex closures. It should have tension that warrants the undermining. But there are very few surgeries where we will remove skin from the patient and create a void, an area that has had skin before, doesn't have now, that you don't need to undermine to some extent to facilitate excellent closures. Oh, there's some exceptions. There's some really good, as I'm getting older, I notice. There's some good areas where the amount of undermining is significantly less. But I think that I see a lot of people lose opportunity, correct reimbursement opportunity, and therefore reimbursement as a whole, because they undercode surgical closures.
Yeah, That is definitely an area that I don't do surgery at this office, but I think I was probably one of those who underbilled for surgical closures.
Well, where it really shows a huge discrepancy is when we're underbilling as PAs and the docs aren't.
Yeah.
And what happens is it looks like that they're getting lesser of a service. So from every aspect, it just inherently looks like lesser of a service. Why are we doing cheaper surgeries? Because we're not doing a cheaper surgery at all.
Right.
So our PA is just cheaper. And the word cheap should almost be struck from the vernacular of a PA. We're not giving a lesser service. We're not giving a lesser diagnosis. We're not diagnosing something lesser. We're not writing a prescription that's lesser or cheaper. We're giving the exact same service. And if we're conducting the exact same surgery, which the argument can be made that we should be, if it is medically warranted, there's no reason why a physician should be doing surgery A and PA is doing surgery B, a lesser version of that. If it's indicated, it should be done, and it should be billed the same.
Yeah. Do you recommend that PAs do an audit in their office, or how would that look so that you can compare all the providers?
Ooh, that's a good question and a difficult one. So a PA should probably not audit across the board at all, or initiate an audit across the board at all. It's not your business. So you're going to hear the businessman in me coming out.
Yeah.
You should be interested in your audit. You should be interested in a method by hopefully that practice has a way of giving you feedback to look at your codes across the board. But the direct comparison should probably come from the practice owner, in fairness. I've seen groups where they do it and they'll create audits. And you know what's funny is that their business meetings, their business examples, I've attended these in business class and variety. They actually recommend that you actually publish all persons' data, but not indicate who's who.
Right.
Because that creates a weird sense of ostracization where all of a sudden you're going to start nitpicking somebody. But it's very important. If you could see, let's say you had 6 providers, it'd be neat to see that if you and one other provider, unknown, provider X, seem to constantly underbill this thing, and these other 4 are doing it. Now, if the other 4 are talking at lunch or over coffee about how greedy they are and how unethical they're billing, well, that might just tell you that that confirms it, because they may be overbilling.
Yeah.
But if you feel like you're doing everything the same and you're kind of questioning your knowledge, and remember, there's no excuse. You know, we're either being ignorant because we don't know, or we're being willfully ignorant because we're scared. And there's probably no, in my opinion, there's no excuse for either. We owe it to our patients and we owe it to our business to not be either of those. And so if a comparative analysis, I think companies should do, and I think companies it would be in their best practice to publish those amongst their constituents. So if I owned a practice and I had 6 providers across the board, I would publish generic information. So no one would be indicated, but you would see where they're, because I would want them to understand where they're, but you're not supposed to bill to the mean. So what you don't want to do is take that information and say, I'm just going to start billing more.
Right.
You should learn where you're not billing correctly and then bill correctly, because it only becomes greedy and unethical and unlawful when you just start manipulating the system. You just want to work within the system.
Yeah.
And the system is pretty easy to work with. It just takes a little bit of time and effort. You don't have to become a coding master, but to become blatantly unaware is not helpful. You would never, none of our viewers, I would never expect a colleague to be blatantly unaware of a disease process in the skin.
Right.
Just like, psoriasis is such a pain in the butt. I don't want to learn anything about it. I don't want to prescribe, biologics, they're such a pain to get approved. I'm just not going to write them.
Right.
You're a disservice to the profession, but you're a disservice to the patient who probably needs that medicine in that case, if it warrants. So being painfully ignorant of the business practice is also not helping anybody. It's not helping you make more. It's not helping you bring value to the practice.
So you have to educate yourself.
To some extent. You don't have to devote your entire life or a great portion of your time and energy learning about business. What I learned about business, the only reason I learned about business, just like some people learn about gardening, is because I'm freakishly entertained by it. I love all aspects of this profession. So I would have been inclined to learn about it anyway. And I still don't know everything, and I'm very adamant that I don't.
Yeah.
Some of my colleagues started asking me about time billing, which I know is a trap, and I just tell people stay away from the time trap.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to claim to be an expert in it, because once I learned enough to know that that's a horrible way to bill in general, across the board, if you're unanimously billing everything as a time, yeah, you're not going to do it right.
Yeah.
It's going to be bad.
Yeah, definitely. And I will encourage our viewers to join. If you're in SDPA, check out the forum, because Jason, you are so generous with your information and your time. If anybody asks a question, you're always willing to give more information. And thank you for coming today and sharing your information with us.
Thanks. Let me talk on the forum real fast,
Yeah.
and then we'll. I really wish I was more consistent on the forum. I will write in spurts. I might get on there for 6 months straight and almost check it daily and just constantly write. I write like I talk, so you can kind of hear my voice inflection. I do believe that people with knowledge in this profession owe it to our profession to help. It's the only way you can take this body of people and move them forward as a collective. So I don't do it for my own good. I like doing it, but I do it because I think we owe it to each other. If you have a bit of information and someone comes to talk to you about it, please spend the time to talk to a colleague. You know, you get people that are 1 to 5 years into this profession, and they're trying to glean some information off of somebody that has been in it for 15 years. And if you shun them off, you're just perpetuating their ignorance further, and they were making the effort to come out to you. I've always done everything I've done in the advice I've given for contracts for free, and I do that, and I will continue to do that forever, because it holds me to no expectation. So if I give them advice that they hate, they can just write it off. If I charge them money, they would be like, hey, I want you to tell me what I want to hear.
Right.
But instead, I just call it like I see it. I give the best information I have access to, and I don't mind if you take it or not.
Yeah.
And but I do like it. I wish I was on there more often, and I'm always available for email if people ever want to email me.
Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thanks.
Hope Cook signing off with Dermcast.live in Austin.